Hello everyone, a quick overview for Project 2 Information Hierarchy as you move into tasks 3 and 4 this week. Task 3, what I'll do is we'll just talk a little bit about it and then I'll show you some examples. We'll continue with the examples that I was showing you for tasks 1 and 2. I'll just show you some that I won't go past 3 and 4, so I'm going to just show you examples as we move through the different tasks in the project, okay? So we'll make it quick here today. So task 3 is any size, any weight using lines or line segments and black and white only. Okay, so by any size and any weight, we mean it can be as small or as large. You can combine smaller type and larger type. You can combine multiple weights now, not just 2 or 1. And you're going to introduce the use of lines, okay, or line segments. So how you're going to use line is up to you. I'm going to show you a few examples. We talked a little bit about it when we got into the project overview last week, but hopefully this will be clearer today. So we'll, considering that, how do I use lines? Again, we'll look at some examples. The same is true for task 4, where again you have any size and any weight, and you're using reversed type. Okay, so when we're talking about reversing type, we're talking about it in a black and white situation. White type is reversed out of a black field. Okay, that black block that we're saying here, type block, that can take that term very loosely. It can take the shape of many different things, as we'll see. So it can be as minimal as literally a little like rectangular block of type with some white type shown reversed out of it. It can cover an entire page. It can be a little sliver on a page. I'm not saying you have to use a minimum amount of space that the type is reversed out of. How you use that reverse type is going to be totally up to you. But again, you're going to be working with black and white only, okay? So now when we're talking about any size, any weight, that's a lot of freedom, which is cool. Is it necessary to use a bunch of sizes and bunch of weights just because you can? Not necessarily. Sometimes, yes. It just depends on what your goal is. And again, just to clarify, because when I introed the assignment, what I was saying was essentially what we're concerned about here are 8x8 compositions that work as well as they can given the content that you're working with. Okay, I didn't say these were specifically anything in particular. That they're not little mini posters, they're not little mini flyers, they're not an ad in a square 8x8 art magazine. They could be all of those, or they don't have to be. Okay, so I don't want to get too hung up about that. Obviously, what we're doing here is we are promoting a store here. And again, this says Magma Covent Garden. These are earlier versions. The content there has changed a little bit. And these are just ways to showcase the little blurb about the place, get the essence of the place. And hopefully you're thinking about the fact that, okay, this is like a art and design bookstore in England. And who are those customers for a place like that? They're people like you. We say that a lot, but it's true. It's designers, artists, creative types, people that are interested in all these different topics, subjects, and might be interested in books or art supplies or cool totes or teas or whatever it is. Okay. So here is an example of task 3. We looked at this at the end of the intro to task 1 and 2. And when I was talking to you guys about grids, I showed this example. And essentially, if you remember this one was, these lines were basically laid out on the grid. And they were sort of randomly placed. I mean, obviously here, this is a way to divide this sort of, logistics information here with this list. Because you have this, these two rows here aligning, or these two columns directly lining across the baseline. So they share the same baseline. When you get down here, you don't have to be so worried about this being confusing because now you're working on every other line. Okay, so they're offset a little bit here. That's done by design. And these basically were lines that were, essentially noting where parts of that grid underlies without giving the whole structure away. But they also add a bit of structure to the page. They solidify the information a little bit. They sort of make it a little more, they coalesce it. Is that the right way? They make it a little more cohesive. Um, and at the bottom here, when you have the little blurb and the URL, which is on its own, they add a little bit of an anchor point here for this little flag of information. Okay, so they're used to divide up space. They're also visual elements. I mean, they are. They're aside from just working to solidify the page and divide up information, they provide a visual component as well. Okay, so they can be functional, the lines, structural. They can also be design elements, okay, depending on how you choose to use them. That's up to you. Now, the thing is, when you're doing at least 3 versions of each, 3 to 5 iterations, some of you, like I said, will do more, explore both options. Explore the option of line as a functional element to divide information or create structure, and also explore options where it is a more of an aesthetic choice that you're working with, okay? So for example, here, now this is a tricky one, and I'm going to show you some examples. As you guys know, sometimes I'll show you examples. I won't say all of these are perfect examples, but they present ideas that are worth, seeing to think about how other people approach the problem. And people get creative with their solutions. So here you have an extremely thin version. I'm assuming this is Helvetica Neue or Helvetica New, one of their ultra light or super, the extra thin or whatever the weights are. And they've worked with Aligns to continue, and they've done it pretty well, considering the fact that it's fairly seamless. Some of these they've actually just taken elements from the typeface and extended them further, and breaks up the page in a graphically interesting way. Are they totally functional now? I mean, only in that they create some attention-getting visuals, and that sometimes is a good thing. I think here, I like the fact that they worked with their text boxes, to align with the lines here. All they did is to do this. All you have to do is draw your text box to be that shape. Or you can, if you can also just set a regular text box and then space it in each line, which they may have done as well, which is probably easier in this case because there isn't a lot of type. You could argue that it's a little tricky. This gets pretty short, these lines. They're making a design decision and pushing it a little bit, which is cool. I think the line spacing could be better. I think the line spacing looks maybe default, which is a bummer. I feel like the line spacing is the only thing here that isn't really carefully considered, which is, it throws it off. So it's a cool example, and I dig it, but you can see where that could have been pushed further. Another one where line is, it's dividing up space on the page, which is cool. These are not part of it. These are actually trim marks so that you can see the edge of the page actually is here. But one thing I have to say this person did is create a really killer sense of depth with line. So again, and this might even be the same person as the last one, I can't remember, but line spacing and sizes here, you do all this killer stuff, and then these don't feel finished, which is a bummer. And this is cool. You can see they really shrunk the type here. I'd say this is too small. I think you could rework this. But given that they wanted to make it fit in this little lockup, I understand why they did it. But I think the only downside there is you have one size here, which is larger. You have another size here, and then another size here, and then, again, you can use multiple sizes, but they need to still feel cohesive. Like these don't feel like they're connected. It works because they're almost secondary to the visuals of the lines. But in terms of the fine tuning that could have happened there, they missed the mark. But line used in a really interesting way. You can see here, hey, they use dotted lines too. Nobody said you couldn't. Okay, so that's kind of an interesting combination of line styles they put here. Really cool. Another version here, used in a more subtle way, more similar to the first layout we looked at. And, really nice consideration given to weights and sizes here and line spacing and things. I like this page, It's tricky when you only get down to 2 lines. They try to stay consistent with their line spacing, which I think is good. When you only have the 2 lines, that line spacing looks a little bit open, but not enough to really bother me that much. And, it's a nice job here working with essentially the multiple angles, but still feeling cohesive. Essentially 2 different sizes, the main title here, and these are about the same size, but the weight differential is a key component. And you can see, man, this person detailed out their type, their baseline shift in the parentheses, the letter spacing. Don't forget those things. Don't forget your word spacing. They put in some, they kerned the words here a little bit. They've put in those extra details that make their typography really stand out. Totally different approach, and yeah, it's used as almost an anchor here. You can see it holds these blurbs, these blocks of type here, I should say. But just a graphically very cool use of line, you know. So it's serving some function, but its main function is graphic, which again is really cool. And just, when you do something like this, how, when do you stop putting lines down, or how do you concentrate them, and how do you angle them? And just the different, values they get from these sort of lighter outer edges to this really, dense darks in here. Man, this is really cool. I really like this. I think this should have been more, these sizes could have been worked out a little better. I think these things feel pretty good. I think that feels a little bit big and clunky compared to these. And you can see they have not done their baseline shift here. Little details like that. This is a bummer on the whole layout, because these actually look pretty good. This looks like it was just placed there, which is frustrating. Don't get me started. This is pretty interesting. And this has, multiple things going on. It's obviously line as a functional element because it's dividing the space in a certain way. It's definitely used as a graphic element to, create this really heavy sort of linear texture going on. And it's used almost to create shape even, which is fine. And then, again, just the nice way they offset this line, the way they tweaked the logo and made their own version of it. And then, not going too far, they just have a clean, even though this is split and offset, this is all cleanly done. It's just nicely done. And details here in the typography that matter, their line spacing and their size looks really considered. The size and weight of this compared to this size here. You can see that these sizes are all consistent here. Even with this, they could have gone larger here. This doesn't have to be this exact same size as these two, because this could be considered one unit, and you could proportionally size these, to each other. In your reading, you should have read about the Fibonacci sequence, and we can talk about that on Wednesday, or I should say next class, for a little more information about that. If you go through that and don't understand it, because it's just a way to maybe use the sequence to create proportional sizes. I don't use it all the time, but it can be useful. But really, at the end of the day, it's just eyeball it and you'll be fine. But you can see they did these three blocks the same sort of size, and then this is its own size. But again, really nicely considered. And if you worked later on with color with this, it could be really interesting as well. Although something about the black and white looks great as well. This is the last one for line, and you're going to say, where are the lines? Okay, and that's exactly what I said. And they said, well, James, they're here. See, they're implied. See the way I sliced off the type here? See how that creates this sense of line? See, I'm a sucker for that. I'm a sucker for people showing me something different in terms of how they think or approach a problem. Part of me was like, nah, BS, I don't buy it. And the other part of me was like, good for you. You know what I mean? For thinking differently, and I have to reward that. But I tell you, a big part of why I went with it is because they crafted the heck out of this thing. Okay, everything else, like, yeah, they did that, but everything just feels good. It feels right. Sizes, spacing, you could open the spacing a little bit on these blocks, but just, well done. And so when something's well done, you tend to be like, all right, you know what, I'll work with you on that. So interesting. One example of task 4 now, getting into task 4, any size, any weight using reversed type. Again, don't get hung up on reversed type blocks. That's just meant to be shape. Okay, so you can see essentially what they've done here is reversed it out of the shape and minimized that shape so much that essentially what you're dealing with for the most part is the counterform in the letters. Still able to identify, but again, nicely done, nicely sized. A great example of Helvetica when it starts to get big again, especially at a a heavier weight, and works well. There's enough difference between here, and here that they don't feel like they're getting in each other's way. I don't know that this was totally necessary. I think probably why they did it is it added a counterpoint here. So if you just had this and just this was all the same weight, it might feel a little bit off. I think that what they could have done was maybe used a heavier weight here. That just feels a little stuck in there. So you could decide whether or not that was, I think probably what they might have done was think maybe if this doesn't, cut the mustard, if James doesn't consider this doable, then here I am. Here's my safety. I don't know for sure. But regardless, nice job. And you might be looking at this and going, James, what's up with that tight line spacing? That was a conscious decision. You can tell it's done that way. So when it gets bigger and heavier, you have a little bit of room to start pushing things. You can see A centers and D centers are crashing into each other. That's done intentionally. There's a certain cheekiness to that, which is fine. Okay, if it's well crafted, it's good to go in my eyes. Okay, you can see another one here that's actually supposed to be trimmed at the black. Here is someone that just went, I'm going for the whole thing, just going to reverse the whole thing, and that's cool too. This is what they did other versions. But here, one of the things they did beautifully is, man, that Magma Covent Garden is killer size. I mean, you can see that's where Helvetica gets big and heavy, and especially with the reverse, it just looks so good, I think I might have opened up the spacing on this list a touch to match these. I don't know if it looks a little, just ever so slightly tighter, but they did a nice job. Nice line breaks, all that kind of stuff. I might have gone down here and put a little space between the parentheses and the two and refine this area a little bit. But overall, nicely done. Helvetica, big and bold and reversed. It looks killer. All right, here they are using the M for Magma and reversing type out of that. Pretty straightforward. So yeah, you can use a character and reverse the type out of that. Again, what you can't do is bring in random graphic elements. So you can't bring in a vector graphic of something that already exists. If you're making a shape or using a letter form or whatever it is, that's one thing. But you can't bring in something else. You can't bring in an illustration of some sort and reverse it out of that. Okay, so it's something it's got to be made from you. It's got to come from the type. I'm not looking for anything illustrative or a picture of anything. We'll have time for that later. This is for again, just blocks or shapes that you've created or type or letters or whatever it is. Okay. Another example here. All right, just using the background, and really nice job of breaking up that space and then breaking up the type in such a way where it just creates some interesting different planes happening, although still very flat. And again, considered typography, well spaced, and everything's proportionally sized in a way. So again, you can see, even though you're allowed to use multiple sizes and multiple weights, they were smart enough to say, well, I'm going to keep this, and this the same size, and I'm going to let this really stand out on its own. Did they need to go thin, a little bit thicker, bold? That was the call they made. Maybe that's some nice visual variety. That would have been interesting to see if this was also just in one weight, maybe in bold like this. But regardless, nicely done. Okay. That's getting into color, so we won't talk about that. One thing I did want to touch on too is that in the list as it's presented to you in Canvas, things are broken up, and there you might see parentheses dividing all of these. I'm sorry, parentheses, commas used, and you don't see little dashes like this or dividers like this here. You have a little bit of leeway there. If you obviously take out the commas, you don't need those if you're depending on how you're listing them. If you're listing them in a list like this, obviously you don't need the commas. Some people will divide them using dots, like little bullet points. That's fine. If you got to know how to use a bullet point, though. If you use a bullet point, you got to work with the baseline shift and scale it down a little bit, and we'll talk about that later. We'll talk about that when I tell you a little bit more about style sheets. Okay. But last thing I'll say here is iterations. Because you're doing 3 to 5 of each one. Again, we talked about this a little bit, but if I have a couple, 1 or 2 in task 2 that I really like, that I'm not going to use for my final, and I think they could potentially work for task 3 if I bring in lines, or task 4 if I bring in shapes, you can do that. But if you do that, just make sure you have enough variety between all of your process work to, show a breadth of explorations, okay? And at the end of the day, remember that the final 7 are going to be 7 unique compositions different from one another, okay? So just remember that as well. All right, so this is it for tasks 3 and 4. My next video I'll be posting is about style sheets and a little bit more InDesign stuff. Until then, any questions, do not hesitate to get in touch. Hope you guys are well.